Good afternoon, elected members and members of the public. Welcome to today's session on the rates review. I'd firstly like to introduce Jeff Poland, who's our manager, a manager in the finance team who looks after the project side of our business. So he's been working closely on the rates review project and will continue to do so throughout this project. So I will hand over to Jeff to do an introduction and start working through the slides. But as a starter for you, in your portal, in the workshop area, the presentation is sitting in there for you as well, just in case that makes it a little bit easier for you guys to see things as you work through. But it will be, for the members of the public, it will be the same thing that you see on your screen as you work through as well. So if you go into workshops, that's the one. Yep. As well, in terms of questions and comments, feel free, because it's a detailed topic, don't hesitate to just put up your hand or put your buzzer on and ask questions as we work through. If we get to a number of detailed questions, we may choose to park a bunch of them and address them at a certain point in time. But for the start, and we'll monitor how we go, but feel free to just ask questions as we go. You'll notice that we also have a whiteboard set up, so we'll hope to gather additional items to explore and ideas as we work through the presentation today. So the rates review is just a part of the wider, we'll just park for 1 minute and maybe Ashley can assist, or somebody in the team can assist an elected member with finding in the workshops. So the rates review is, for this long-term plan amendment, is a critical part of the reason why we're doing an amendment. In the last triennium, the elected members requested that the council work through a rates review as part of the LTPA amendment process. So that's the key reason why we are working through this. In terms of the council's financial strategy and the setting of the long-term plan, this is a key decision or a key policy review that gives you the opportunity to have a look at how we share rates across this district. It's a key thing that you have an opportunity to have a decision and lead in terms of how those rates are shared and to decide for yourselves what's equitable and fair in terms of a distribution of rates. So we'll hand over to Jeff and we'll start into the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just to perhaps reinforce a couple of things that Jacinta has said. There is quite a bit of information in the rates area for you to absorb, so feel comfortable about coming back to us and asking questions. Right, why are we doing this basically? Jacinta's indicated that elected members previously have asked for this to be done, and at the same time it's good practice to review the system used to allocate rates. The purpose of the review is to make sure that we have the most appropriate and equitable way of sharing the rates across the district. And one of the issues we think we face is the affordability of rates for the ratepayers. We think that's an issue and we want to try and see if we can find a way to address that. As indicated, since indicated, then we're doing this in terms of the incorporated in the LTPA amendment. And the timelines for doing this review are set out in that program charter and plan for the long-term plan amendment.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm just going to get into that in a little bit more detail. So today we've got our first introductory workshop. And there's a couple of things, or a number of things that are happening concurrently as part of the rates review. So quotable value are finishing up the rating or the valuation of the district. That's being finished at the moment, and that will be there. We've just been through an audit process with the Valuer General. They've given us a green light in terms of the valuation that quotable value have gone through, which is positive. Those values will be confirmed on Friday. At that stage, quotable value, we've scheduled them to come in and present the results of that valuation to you on the 7th of December. And then as well on the there'll be a press release that will go out as well next week to let the community know that evaluation has occurred and give them the opportunity to either contact quotable value directly or to come in to the council and have a look at what their values look like. So that's what's happening at that stage. There will also be an individual letter that'll go out to the community letting people know what their new values are. Now, they will start to, in terms of timing, they will be communicating that from the 7th. So before it gets communicated to the public and before those individual letters go out, you will have a presentation from quotable value so that you understand that information well and have an opportunity to ask questions. But leading up to there, once we've got it finalized on Friday, we will make sure once information is final and available, we'll share it with you before that briefing as well so that you have an understanding of what that looks like. It's really important during that stage as well that we communicate well, because often the messaging can be, my value has gone up, therefore I'm going to need to pay more in rates, or the council is trying to seek more revenue in rates, rather than understanding that it's actually the way that it's shared rather than getting more money in. So we'll do our best to be really clear in that process and communicate well out to the public. And as well, it's really important for us that we communicate well to you so you understand where everything sits, so that when you're asked questions of the members of the community that you can answer those comfortably. So then that sort of is what's happening in December. As well, we've talked to you about rating working groups. And when I talk about rating working groups, some thinking that we've had, and this is an opportunity for this table to have a discussion about today, is some thinking for us was groups like Federated Farmers, ratepayers associations, Grey Power, other key interested parties that would really like to have a say in how rates are shared early on as we're doing the modelling and coming up with different options. We want to try and get that group together in December. So for at least an initial discussion so that we can, if they've not heard the conversation today, we can go through the presentation with them and then have a bit more of a conversational chat about what we're thinking, the outcome of this workshop today, and then also hear any ideas and thoughts that they have as well. That then gives an opportunity for us to do more work leading up to Christmas. We've got some council workshops scheduled at the end of January and also in February. And then again, you can see we've got some further rating workshops scheduled with those interested groups. So in terms of, maybe it might be a good point just to pause on that one. And when I've mentioned those groups, are there any thoughts that anyone wanted to raise at this point that they, in particular around groups that you would like to make sure are consulted or involved in the ideas and the conversation early?
Kia ora. Thank you for that. I suppose just as a consideration as iwi groups actually, one, obviously iwi are landowners and ratepayers and contributing to the overall package, but then there might be other aspirations that they might see potential rating money they provide being used in things that they would like to see it providing towards. So. And the other one was Māori land actually. I'm not sure if that's still an issue for council, but there was an issue around rating of Māori land, Māori reserve land, even our cemeteries. So I don't know if that still sits there or not, but it's certainly stuff that we'd like to see considered. Thank you.
So in terms of involving iwi hapu Māori in the conversation, absolutely. Maybe we could have a conversation offline about the best way to facilitate that, but absolutely that is a great idea in terms of making sure it's something we've thought of. It's just about how exactly we do it in the best way.
If I could just answer your question around the rating of Maori freehold land, there is a new piece of legislation that came in last year that enabled us to clean up some of the old outstanding rates on Maori freehold land, and also gave us some guidance around the rating of Maori freehold land going forward. So I'm happy to have a chat with you about that as well.
Just and Jeff, just on to consultation. When I know that Kirikiri, the community board, are well versed. I wonder about do we see anything particular around the progressive associations? Is that a great way of getting that, that message out to the community as well? So I can't remember historically we've done anything particularly with them, but
we absolutely can. Yeah, it really is thinking around those groups that are going to have a keen interest in it and would like to have a say before consultation options are decided on.
Yeah, good. Yeah, because I know if council make the approach, they would set up a community hui, and we come along to, etc., which gives them a little bit of ownership too. So just consideration during that.
Noting, sorry, Sam, were you? Way you go, Sam.
Thanks, Bernie. Jacinta, just a question around strategically. I wonder whether it's worthwhile looping in the forestry lobby groups or whatever I don't know. I think there's a couple of different groups, because for me that's one group that is going to need to be the focus of some of our attention and energy, is in terms of those forestry block owners, and how, because there's obviously issues around impact on roading and that kind of thing for those particular property uses. And so I'm quite keen to ensure that part of this process involves a focus on forestry in particular. And so strategically it might be important to loop them in early.
Thanks, that's a good idea, and I think you'll notice as we work through the slides there is a question or some comments that I plan to raise around forestry and whether there was an appetite to explore some sort of differential in the roading space, for example, at this stage of a rates review. So absolutely, we can note that down.
In light of the Chief Executive comments around the community connection being available online and our database in terms of that, I just wonder, is it worth, a pre-consultation engagement with those on that database in terms of survey or questions around what are the important things for them in regards to rates, so we do get a little bit of an idea before we go into the consultation period around what are the big issues we should be talking about.
Happy to have a chat with Lisa and the team around how we might be able to do that. So that sort of covers the rating workshops and the council workshops. What we're planning to do, I'll just touch on a little bit here probably. In terms of consultation, the intention is that we will be going out to the community at quite a detailed level. That will be in terms of some background information around what do rates look like, how are they charged, what are we thinking we're doing in this space, what's our rationale in terms of the decision and the options that we're putting forward. As well, because we will have a valuation change occurring as part of this rates review as well, the intention is that we will send out a letter to each household, and when they receive that letter, that will tell them what their proposed rates increase is as part of the next year. It will also tell them what portion of it is due to a rates review, what portion of it is due to a valuation change, and what portion is due to the rates increase. So they can get a bit of a breakdown in terms of what's steering their rates increase. Some experience that I've had in the past when I've done rates reviews at Kapiti was that worked really well, because it did give everyone the opportunity to understand what was going on, provided some links to them about where to find more information, and that also gave them an understanding of what was impacting them and why was it impacting them, so they had a chance to give good feedback through the consultation process if they wanted to. As well, we'll talk a little bit more about this as we work through, but the intention through this process is for you to have a good set of evidence-based analysis that you can use in the conversations that you have with the community. So I'll show you a little bit more about what that looks like as we talk through things. But effectively, there will be a lot of collateral and analysis and evidence that you can use through that consultation process to be able to communicate with the community. I would see us going out and having a number of sessions with different groups, both with our team, the wider LTP team, and with yourselves to communicate to those areas that might need more, and we can see how it goes in terms of through the process. Then in terms of, we'll have the hearings as we do for the rest of the LTP, deliberations, and then the adoption of the LTP and annual plan on the 21st of June. So that's a whistle-stop tour of everything rates review, but there'll be a number of steps in between. Oh, cool. Cheers. So what will be your role in this process? Ultimately, you're the decision maker. You're the one that's steering. You are the ones that are steering what is going to occur in this space. So it does need a high level of elected member engagement as well as community engagement in this process to make it effective. As we mentioned before, it's elected members' role to decide what is a fair and equitable way of sharing rates and or paying for services. We can guide you and provide you with options. We can provide you with ideas in terms of what might be done elsewhere, but ultimately that is your decision to make based on the evidence that we provide you. As well, in terms of public-private split, that's something that can be considered during this process as well. So, for example, in the regulatory space is one area that has been discussed. We might not be compliant in terms of the level of split between public and private at the moment, and we'll come to you in both on the 7th and the 14th of December, letting you know what those splits look like and the compliance with the revenue and financing policy based on the LTP amendment budget that we'll put to you. You'll have a chance then to decide on whether you want to change any of that. What that will do or may do, for example, is if you choose to reduce the level of fees, for example, that are coming through in a particular area, ultimately that will mean that we'll need more in the rate space to help that. So then you may not decide to cover every area, but you may have some change that you might want to make in that space. And again, there will be a number of workshops to work through this, but they do end up running out quite quickly once you get into it. So in terms of steps, really it's around identifying the problem or the problems that need to be fixed. And the key thing that I found in terms of rates reviews are that it's really important that we set a set of high-level principles to explain how rates as a funding source should be shared equitably. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we step through things. But often that really helps guide the conversation with the community and the rationale. If you've got a clear set of principles as to why you want to do things in a particular way, it can help with the communication and the rationale in terms of conversations with the community. Another key step is making sure that we're collaborating with elected members in the community, ourselves together on options, that we're sharing proposals widely, and that we're looking to inform people simply about what it means for them and for the community. Making sure we're considering all feedback and deciding on the preferred approach. Critical to this, of course, because it is ultimately a tax, and we need to make sure that we're compliant, is that through the process everything is being done in a lawful manner. So don't be worried about that. We always make sure we have good legal advice through these types of reviews.
Question, and Councillor Jennings raised property disposals in the last meeting, but I have a property related question around us as landlords where we lease some of our portfolio and they're not necessarily at market rate, some of them. and therefore ratepayers are subsidising those activities in those places. So when we talk about public-private splits, I'd like to review that. I mean, some of them are locked into terms, but there might be some up for renewal. I'd just like to understand the landscape there and what's going on.
Thanks, I've noted that down.
Just the other thing that springs to mind, and I'm not sure where this sits, but if you recall back to 2020, when we were concerned about impacts of COVID, for instance, and we ended up having a negative rate increase, which is a long debate. And I just see today the OCR has gone to 4.25 and they're talking about going to 5.5 in a recession next year. So we're going to have to factor that into the thinking as well, aren't we? In terms of, if we're down talking about, we're always talking about affordability, there's going to have to be a pretty deep, strong conversation about what we're going to do and what we're not, I think, because it's looking pretty ugly out there financially.
I think you're absolutely. We've got infrastructure pressures around interest rate pressures ourselves, cost of infrastructure leading to massive increases for us just to keep the lights on. But absolutely, we may need 9% rates increase, but I'm making up a number at this stage. But what that means for the community then, when taking into account food rises and interest rate fixed rates rolling off for the community as well, it's massive. Yeah. So in terms of starting the conversation about principles, and this is something that it would be great to hear your feedback on through this and ideas of things we can add, is we definitely are aware that affordability of rates is an issue for this district. It's particularly an issue, as we've mentioned before, our rates or expenditure might be really low relative to other councils in New Zealand, but because of the incomes that we have, that ultimately leads to rates as a share of people's income being a lot higher than it might be in different areas of the country. Again, with rates, with income tax, you've got the ability to tax people at different rates depending on their income, and that can be quite personalized because you have that individual information about them. When it comes to rates, ultimately rates is a little bit of a lot more of a blunt tool than is income tax, because when you're setting rates, you can't take into account people's individual household income or circumstances as well as you can when you're setting income tax. So in terms of rating, capital value, which is the full value of someone's property, taking into account both the land value and the value of the buildings that they have on that land, is often referred to as the best proxy that we have in the toolbox of items of assessment for rates for wealth. Effectively, we don't have access to a lot of other personal information for individuals to base any distribution of rates other than that is the capital value or the land value of their property. So for us, that's effectively what is termed generally across New Zealand in terms of the best proxy that we have for wealth. So that's one general point that we can talk about. There have been some reviews happen in the rating space. The most notable one stems back to 2007, which was a long time ago. But it was a local government rates inquiry, and it was done, the lead on it was someone by the name of Dr. Shand. He did a review that said the relationship with incomes is stronger for capital values than it is for land values. So that was the general principle or the analysis that was found at that time. And also there was a point through that review where it was suggested that rates shouldn't be more than 5% of a household's income. So in terms of evidence and discussion in the rating space, that is some work that has been done historically that has helped to guide some thinking in terms of rates affordability and equity in terms of how rates should be shared. So I thought I'd just note those points for now. I guess maybe I'll stop for a minute and just say, does anyone have any other thoughts in this space when they're thinking about, from a fairness and equity perspective, what would be good to consider?
I just wondered if you could provide at a later date within our region which councils are already doing capital rating, and then maybe even look south, since we're doing spatial planning with Wellington. I mean, they're in a different, income wise are way above, but it's just be interesting to know.
Absolutely, we can include something. I've got something that was done a couple of years ago that compared about 10 councils and the mix between land value, capita value, and fixed charges. But when we come to the next workshop before Christmas, I'll make sure that we include that analysis for you.
Jacinta.
Thanks, and I'll remember to keep looking up at your photos. Sorry, Sam.
Oh no, sorry, sweet as. Just a question around, well, affordability and I guess willingness to pay are, two concepts that, because I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in is this whole concept of rates postponement, particularly for over 65s, because there's this issue of where rates might be unaffordable for a big section of our community, but there actually is a willingness to pay and a willingness to meet their contribution, but they simply can't afford to do it. And so rates postponement, particularly for over 65, is one of those mechanisms where it's obviously something that's separate to rate setting, but I think it's a relevant consideration to the whole context of that affordability and willingness to pay. So I'm just wondering how we're intending to, or if we are intending to sort of incorporate that into the scope, or whether we could potentially have a further conversation as a table around it.
Absolutely, we can, and I understand this count a number of years ago did put forward an option to put a rates postponement policy as part of the rates remission and general postponement. So absolutely, that is a consideration, or that is something that if this table would be open to, that is something that we could develop as part of this rates review process. So just to let people know, generally what that means is if somebody isn't able to pay, effectively what they can do is sign up for a rates postponement. What that means is effectively they build up a value of rates owing over a period of time. They generally pay a share of interest for any lost use of money for the council. Then when they get to a point where either they sell that property or that those family members pass on, is that then the council is able to recoup those rates. So it can be increasingly, there are a number of councils that use that nationally. The Department of Internal Affairs was looking at a national rates postponement approach and mechanism to make things a little bit more efficient for councils. That's not yet in place, but is in progress. So absolutely, that's something that if there is a will around the table, we can explore and bring back to you as an option as part of this rates review. There are other things as well that councils do, which we'll touch on as we go through in terms of rates remission, where some councils will offer an additional affordability remissions. So, for example, if a household receives an equivalent of a couple's worth of superannuation, so 42,000 roughly, in terms of household income, and their rates were more than 5% of household income, then they can apply for a remission up to $300, which effectively would be, and in some councils, for example, Kapiti is one example that do it, Wellington City do it as well, where effectively there's $200,000 at Kapiti as an example that's rated or charged to the general ratepayer base, and then those ratepayers that have affordability issues can apply to that fund as long as their rates are more than 5% of household income and their income is at or less than $42,000 a year. They can apply for that $300. So in some instances, councils can use that for those properties where you may have a high value property, but you're a low income family or household. Or there's also the option that Councillor Jennings suggested in terms of rates postponement. So there's a couple of different mechanisms that you could look to use that to address that type of thing if you wanted to. Does anyone else have any other points they wanted to make?
Sorry. I'll go after you. So about that example you just used with Kapiti and 200,000, if you were to put that in our terms, because obviously they've got greater population and higher incomes than us, what would the 200 look like for Hurunwhenua? It's not.
It's a good question. So one thing we will do, and we hadn't quite got to the level of analysis yet, but we have, for all those properties that receive a rates rebate, we know who they are, we know what their incomes are because we need to apply it on their behalf. So we could give you an indication of what that would look like for this district if, say, for everyone that received a rates rebate also applied for this and their rates were more than 5%, we can give you an idea of what that might look like as part of the next workshop. Yeah.
Understand that the use of capital value as a measure. Is there anything sort of internationally that's working that helps with that fairness and spread of rates from an affordability perspective that you would look at or consider something as an option?
Rebates and remissions postponement, those are key ones. I understand there's something in California that was used, one of our staff, in areas where you might have significant growth in the value of properties because they've become popular or the values have grown substantially, is that some councils can provide some sort of relief in terms of the value increase that they're going to rate on. That's something that, so for example, if someone bought a house for $100,000 and it's now worth $1 million, then you could limit it to a certain increase amount so that you're only rated on that. That's something that some councils internationally do. Another one is, this is more around helping to fund for infrastructure rather than a rate side of things, but value capture is another thing that can be done in terms of rating for additional increase in value because council's investing in infrastructure. That's something that has been looked at internationally and is done in some places. Happy to look at some other ones as well, but those would be the main ones that would come to mind for me now.
So my question was more around the income related to for households, and how easy is it to actually get that data in terms of household income? So is that pretty easy, and is 5% still the figure that they talk about? I mean, that's 2007. So is that relevant in 2022?
It's a tricky one. It probably needs a reassessment in terms of if, for example, rates are probably increasing in terms of the increase in the value of rates relative to the increase in the value of wages.
We know that the price of housing has not kept up, or the price of housing has far exceeded the increase in wages. So, that's obviously a different sort of relativity, if you like, in terms of that. And that's where do you have any idea in terms of what the number of households, say, currently in the district would have, 5% of their income, or more than 5% of their income in rates?
led on to that very well. Thank you. So just if you have a look at the screen now, we've got a number of heaps of work for when the census information. So the last time the census was done was 2018. So that's the last time we can get household income information. They have things called SA1 and SA2. They used to be called mesh blocks and area units, but effectively they're called now SA1s and SA2s. SA1 is the smaller area, SA2 is the bigger one. So what you've got in front of you here, what we've done is we've taken the 2018 census. We have then increased that income by the labour index since the time that the census was done, because that's about the most, not scientific, but it's the best proxy we've got in terms of income growth. And what we've done for you is at a SA1 level and an SA2 level, we've looked at what are rates as a portion of median household income within each SA1 and SA2. So I'm just going to flick on, actually I won't now. So you pick each little parcel, which is the this is SA1. This is the SA1 area. Generally, there are roughly how many houses, Jeff?
SA1, well, depends.
It's the smallest area that the census will provide income information publicly. So we take the middle point or the middle income for that level, and we take rates as within that, median rates that we have within that area. So we go into our rating database, pick the median rates for that little area, and then we were able to figure out what our rates as a portion of median household income for those individual ones. So it gives you a good idea of where there are affordability issues. So you can see, it's hard to see because there's a lot of detail on this one graph. We'll get into a bit more. But in areas of Levin and also within Foxton, there are some SA1 areas or parts of the community where rates can be as high as 10% of income for some people. So that is an issue. And as we talk through the way that we rate and a little bit more information, it'll help to understand why for some areas that might be 10%. And also for a significant portion of the community as well, it can be as low as 1 and 2% of their income. So I'll jump back to that. We'll jump back a little bit now, but just to give you a sense that there is underpinning these different things and the options that we'll talk to you about. We've got a base to start from, which kind of says where are the pockets of affordability issues. And then what you can do as a table is we can decide on different options that you might want to look at that might help to address that. We can then model those, and then you can see what impact that has on those individual SA1 areas so that we can understand whether the options that you're putting forward or the options we're considering do actually have the impact that we're intending.
So that's that analysis, or it's sound. It's based on 2018 information. But do you have zoomed in? Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, so we do, as part of the work that we'll do with you, you will get all of this at a detailed SA1 area. So you'll know for those individual areas, and for example, let's just flip to one. Oh, sorry for... And this is at an SA2 level, so this is slightly bigger. But as an example, Foxton Beach, which is one of the SA2 areas, has a median land value of $185,000. It has a median capital value of $365,000, a median household income of $66,174, and then rates as median rates as a percentage of household income is 4.36%. For the different options that we'll talk to you about in a little while, you can then see how that then affects the median rates as a portion of median household income for those individual properties or the median property in Foxton Beach. So as we work through the evidence, as part of the consultation material and as part of the analysis that we'll give you to work through, is you'll have all this at as much detail as you want to help inform the decisions that you want to make. Apologies, Councillor Jennings.
Oh, no, no worries. I just had, and you might have gone beyond it, but it was just some comments on those high-level principles or general principles that we were discussing. And I just wondered whether the topic, and I'm sure Deputy Mayor Ellen's probably going to respond to this, but just a conversation around harmonisation and the approach to harmonisation. And obviously a starting principle around harmonisation is important, but I think there needs to be some discussion around whether that remains the right approach, particularly given that we have a catchment approach for development contributions, and I guess that also ties in with one of the points you made, Jacinta, around like one of the key things I'm keen to see through this process is that if you as a landowner are benefiting from capital investment in particularly in growth areas, and I'm thinking as some examples, Tarara Road, we've got a big industrial area which is being land banked, and obviously also Taraika as a development where there's a huge amount of investment going into infrastructure, and property owners are likely to see a benefit in terms of increased land value, and they may choose not to develop, which is their right. Obviously, private property rights prevail, but there needs to be some sort of high-level principle that if there is benefit, or if there is, I guess, an increase in value in land, that there needs to be some form of acknowledgement through the rating system around that. So that option that you were talking about, I think you called it uncaptured. I can't remember what you called it, sorry, but that sort of value capture, I think is an important sort of high level principle that we need to be thinking about as we go forward.
Just to respond to that, and look, absolutely happy, Sam, to keep it in the mix, but we have to be sure, I think, that we're comparing apples with apples, because DC's development contributions and the decision to place different levels depending on where they sit in the district is about realising the actual costs of new or extended developments in the district. Those costs lying with the newbies, the developers, the newbies. Harmonisation, and that's a sound principle, all that stuff. Harmonisation is an equally sound but quite different principle, which is the right to core infrastructure for people who live in the district, regardless of their income and where they live, that there are some bottom lines about you will have access to that infrastructure and it will be made affordable as a district across the district because we are a district. So I'm happy to have those principles as two separate apples and orange principles, if you like. So I don't know whether we should be getting into too much detailed debate now, but I'm just taking up the challenge, Sam, which you gave to me.
Thanks. And maybe for those that are in terms of that harmonisation conversation, it might be useful if you could, if you let me know by email what types, when you're thinking about harmonisation, what you're thinking in that space, Councillor Jennings, possibly. Are you referencing more in the water space, or are you meaning community infrastructure and things at the moment which are harmonised?
Yeah, I guess. Well, I mean, one of the things that surprised me on your slides was that there's separate water rate for Foxton Beach and then general. So, because I was under the impression that we were harmonised right across water, but other than for water metering. So, but I guess that's the question is because harmonisation ultimately means cross subsidisation. Like, so one community is subsidising another community, because so there are elements of Deputy Mayor Alan's discussion that I don't entirely agree with, but I guess it's just getting a feeling around the table whether the current approach to harmonisation is people are comfortable with that, or whether there is appetite to have some discussion around what does it actually mean for our district. Because if I'm a lone voice in the space, then I'm obviously not going to waste officers' time looking at it.
I wonder whether we just get Jacinta to go back in the presentation and maybe just talk about what is harmonisation and the types of rates that we have.
Yeah, Jeff's just going to talk through each rate at this stage to give you an idea of, for each rate that we charge, what's the basis with which it's charged, how much are those rates in total at an individual level, and then who it covers. And I think some of those things will come out as part of some of those conversations, or questions around harmonisation will come out as part of that conversation.
Right, so this is Rates 101. There's quite a bit of detail in here, but I'll just try and give you an indication of rate by rate how it works. So the first rate is the general rate. The general rate is split into two parts. So there's a district-wide rate and a farming rate. Both of those are based on land value, so that's just the land value is what the rate's calculated on. You can see that the general rate brings in about 8.8 million. And the little number next to it is the rate in the dollar. So if you have a land value of 100,000, then that little calculation gets applied to the 100,000, and that's what the general rate for that property is. Sorry. Yeah.
I'll just quickly mention in regards to the general rate. So as part of the last long-term plan, there was a change that was put forward, or that went through, in terms of a rating review. What happened in that is, the reason why there is a general rate district-wide and a general rate farming is because it was determined, and it's a policy decision of the council, that in general, farming properties, so those that are used from a quotable value perspective, that are used for farming purposes, generally are properties that have significant value or size in terms of land value. So it was determined that it would be unfair to charge the same price per dollar of land value for significantly larger properties or sections of land that are used for farming than it would for the same rate for smaller sections. So that's the reason why for every acre of land, if you've got an acre of land in the city that's got a house on it, or you've got an acre of land or a significantly bigger property in the farming area where it's used for farming purposes, they'll pay 50% of the value per unit, or per acre of land. So, per area of land value is what I should say. So that's the reason why those two are there. That's not uncommon as well from a number of councils that have rural areas, if they're based on capital value or they're based on land value, to have some form of a differential, which is effectively a different rate. Does anyone have any questions on that one?
Right, so the same applies to solid waste. So there is solid waste rate is a targeted fixed rate, and it's based on what's called a SOAP. And everybody in this world will go, what's a SOAP? So a SOAP stands for a separately used or inhabitable portion of a property. And there are great debates about SOAPs, but that's what we use for rating for solid waste. Once again, there's a differential. So the rural community pays only 20% of the total cost of the solid waste costs. And you can see that the column that says the dollar per property, then the solid waste towns pay $1.64 and solid waste rural pays $1 at $111. Once again, based on the coverage, solid waste towns is where the towns are, and the solid waste rural is where the rural community is.
Jeff,
Yeah.
just sorry, can I just drill down into this one a bit more, because I think this is one that the community will be particularly interested in. That the solid waste rate for towns obviously includes a curbside recycling service and other things like that. But in the rural space, what services are they actually directly receiving, or is it or is essentially the rate covering access to things like transfer stations, landfill, recycling stations, that kind of stuff? Are you able to just provide some overview of what it actually covers for the rural solid waste rate?
In a general sense, it is for access. So while they might not have curbside pickup, they do have access, and there is a provision around recycling facilities, transfer station, the landfill as well. So those are the key reasons why they are also charged for that.
When would be the appropriate time to? I guess it might be because we when we do the full solid waste activity review, and what is that the point? Is it to wait then to do something different with that, or because this is specifically rate related, it should be done through this process? Like, I'm not quite, because it varies what happens out in those rural parts, because I've gone, Potts Road, for example, I see bins out there, and so is that rural or is that urban? It's actually rural. So and then out Waikawa Beach, say, we've got what do they call them? Not a transfer station, but a posse where they can do all their recycling and bits and pieces. So it's semi-accessible, but at the same time, last annual plan or LTP, they asked for a revamp of that, and let's do it better and something new. So, and we were considering that. So, does that mean they're getting a better service? So, what are they, under the rural banner, or because they ain't urban? It's almost like some of that is out of whack now.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. So you'll note there where we say coverage, it's fairly broad in terms of it saying towns or rural. And in terms of the rating policy, it is pretty broad. It says in the towns of. And I think, to your question, if it's always through this process, it would be a good opportunity to pick up things like this and to address them, to make sure that those that are in the service areas that should be paying the higher proportion are paying their share, and those that are maybe not, giving the opportunity for you to address that as part of this, you can absolutely do. So, because particularly those mapped areas, with stormwater and with solid waste in particular, I think if you were to look at who was paying the full rate and who was paying the reduced rate, or if, in particular for stormwater as well, it's a conversation around some are paying and some are paying nothing. It's definitely a conversation that you might want to have. For example, in the stormwater space, some areas, some councils charge it across everyone or a proportion on a capital value basis. They do that on the assumption that if you're driving on roads and you're going into the city area, you're still accessing and using council's stormwater, even though you might not, there might be a differential in terms of service where you live. But in general, there's also service areas within your everyday of accessing supermarkets and going to the library and all those types of things where you are getting benefit from certain services. So those types of conversations, if you've got some thinking in that space, this is definitely an opportunity to raise those points.
I think also part of it is a reflection of how we've grown as a district, and so the maps and the policy setting associated with our current rate settings link back to kind of how we operated as a district 10, 20 years ago. Doesn't actually look at the nature of the development we've had, particularly in that rural lifestyle space or our coastal communities where, they're not rural by definition, but they might be rural by our maps.
So obviously through this process there's an opportunity to review those splits. Okay, so we're up to stormwater. So stormwater is rated on the VAT on the basis of capital value. So capital value is the land value plus any buildings improvement values on the property. Once again, if there's a rate in the dollar per capital value. So once again, going back to the example, so if you had 100,000 in capital value, then it gets multiplied by that 0.000, and it gives you the stormwater rate for that property. And that rate applies to towns only. So there is no stormwater rate in rural.
So same thing applies probably in that respect of the mapping. That some of our lifestyle areas now, we're spending quite a bit of money on stormwater wise, aren't we? Yet they're not being rated for
it. Yes. And that's once again an opportunity through this process to look at whether that applies just to towns or whether we want to extend it to the whole of the district.
Yeah, or they are being rated and we don't have a stormwater network. So we have an example of that out at Waitaniti with Waitaniti Rise, where they pay the stormwater rate. So there's part of kind of what this rates review is going to hopefully allow us to do is tidy up some of the definitions around service and definitions around who receives what and therefore who should be paying for what.
In that case, can I just highlight something that's probably minor and can come, for not this LTP, amendment, the next proper one, and that would be booms. So for 7 months of this year, I lived in Stirling Street, which is southeast corner of Levin. I actually grew up there, but I ended up living there earlier. The whole time in my life, booms never mowed. I now live south end of Bartholomew Road, and I've only been there a few months, and already my booms have been mowed twice. So, what's the difference? I wasn't going to, because I didn't want to make it an issue, but there is an example of this.
My only comment, this is Calder here. Around the stormwater stuff, I sort of wonder too, do we take into consideration land use and land change? But because some of the stormwater implications we see as a district now is not through infrastructure council has put in, but it's through land use of landowners and what they've done and how they've modified their land, which is leading to council having to tidy up stormwater matters. So I'm just trying to get my head around it, and also the weighting of how you rate. So when I was trying to work out the difference between the farming and the township stuff, but I keep going back to Deputy Mayor Allen's comment around it's a district responsibility, and so what I'm really saying is, are farmers, by getting these what's the word I'm looking for? Reduced rates or whatever. What's the incentive for that? Because regardless of where they live, there's less of them out there. They might have a far superior turnover than the same landmass in town. So I'm just trying to understand that. Like, they still got to get services like people in town do, but then it's harder to maintain their roads and their accesses and all those types of things that they want out in a rural sector when we've got compact towns. So I'm sorry, I'm probably not really asking a very good question, but I'm just trying to get my head around it, really.
No, it's a good point, and it's a tricky one to solve, but your points are very valid.
Just pleased, because Councillor Mitchell's no longer sitting around the table.
I'm getting told off.
The long-standing burden of the rural ratepayers. Good question, Justin. Hi, Christine.
The next set of rates, the representation and governance and the aquatic rate is targeted fixed uniform charge, once again based on the SERPs. In the property column, you can see what the rate is for each of those areas. So representation and governance, everybody that has a SERP pays $239.11, and everybody that has a SERP pays $126.12 for the aquatic centres. And both of those rates are across the district, apply right across the board.
Hey, Jeff, could you just remind me what the position is with like care homes and retirement villages? Because they're obviously individual rooms, but so they're SUIPs, but are they, so is each room in a, say, care home or in a each unit in a retirement home, are they all paying the equivalent of a SUIP?
In most cases, yes. Right, rating rate. So the rating rate is done on capital value, as I explained, and once again that's district-wide. So that covers all the roads in the district. There's no differentiation between urban roads or rural roads. Water is a little bit more complex, so there are three parts to the water rate. Once again, it's a targeted rate, uniform charge, where you're connected to the water supply. So the first one of them that pays $442.89 is where anybody is connected to the council water supply except Foxton Beach. The next one down is Foxton Beach, and they pay a slightly less rate for anybody that's connected to the Foxton Beach water supply because they have universal metering. So they have meters on all their properties and they pay water for every cubic metre that they use, where in the rest of the district of those people that have meters, then they get an allowance of 91 cubic metres per quarter. No.
So just to flag, I haven't put all the individual, for Foxton, there's for the first 50 cubic metres charge, there's a certain levy. For the next staged amount, there's another amount, and for the following amount, there's another amount. So I haven't put them all on this table for simplicity, but we can include them.
We can give you that information. And then the third part of that water is the water by metre, and that's where they get their allowance quarterly, and then they pay $2.50 per cubic metre above that allowance.
Could you just explain what drove the decision for roading specifically to be capital value?
I can probably help there a little bit. I'm pretty sure it came out of my first term when there was a big push for capital value, when Doug Law was doing it. There's a big push for capital value. Yeah, David's nodding here. Capital value rating. It was a massive debate around the table because there were some big implications for parts of our district in terms of those values, which no doubt will be another debate at some stage. And I think I think the sweet spot was found eventually to have some part capital, part land value rating to get to where we wanted to get. And I think it was a compromise here around the table. Is that right, David? Yeah.
As well with roading, it's as part of the last LTP, there was also a change where previously the commercial sector had paid a little bit more in terms of the roading rate, but it was decided that it would be no longer, that it was going to be uniform based on capital value. So that was changed as part of the last rates review. So in that space, in terms of the earlier conversations around forestry, if there are changes that, in terms of impact on roads and who should pay, forestry is across New Zealand is one which often gets challenged and changed in terms of forestry vehicles using up or creating more damage to roads than do normal travellers or normal industry. And so often over the past while there have been a number of councils that have sought to have a higher differential or a higher rate per dollar of capital value for the forestry sector than for other parts of the community. So as part of the conversation, that's something that could be featured as part of the conversation through this rates review. So we've been through each rate there. That's a quick pictorial view of the share of the rates by each type. But I'll flick to this next one just to give you a sense of, you look at all the individual rates, but then when you look at the value of those that are fixed, so we're assuming you have one property per unit, that regardless of the value of your property, you pay the same amount in rates. For this council, we have a significantly high proportion of fixed charges. There is a limit in terms of what they are from a local government perspective, and we are very close to that limit. So in terms of affordability, and this links back to what your views are on equity, if you believe that everybody should pay the same regardless of what their property's worth, then you would probably look at this and go, that looks good to me. If you believe that there needs to be some difference depending on the value of property that you own, then you may look to reduce the level of fixed charges. If you assume that capital value is the best proxy that we've got for wealth, or that land value is, then through this process, some of the options that we'll be bringing to you to consider are around changing the level of fixed charges and potentially looking at moving some more to capital value to help reduce the amount of fixed charges. So that's an option that you can, but ultimately, if you assume that those that are struggling to pay are likely probably to have lower value properties than others, then reducing the amount of fixed charges will help to reduce the burden on those properties. So we've talked
Jacinta, can I just jump in there? So what are the options so if you were looking at capital value, so then you would have to supplement that with some tools that deal with undeveloped land, so dealing with that land banking issue, because if you went to capital value, then all of a sudden the distribution across the community obviously then is based on capital improvements to those properties, but and so that it would ultimately reduce the rates burden on potentially high value pieces of land that haven't yet been developed. So what are the? I mean, you've already talked about some tools, but you could obviously move to capital value, but then supplement it with a number of different tools to ensure that there aren't sort of unintended consequences. Is that right?
Yeah, you could, but for example, undeveloped land, though, if it's capital value and you have a massive section of land, that land, if it's, for example, some developers will go through a process of creating a whole bunch of subdivision processes. They will then bring those all back into one parcel before the end of the year so that they only pay one fixed charge per unit. So if you are in a process where you've got land banking and it's one big piece of land that's intending to be 20, then while it's still one piece of land, they're only paying one fixed charge. So moving to something that's more capital value or land value based, make sure that they're paying a bigger share of their value that they've got in the land that they've yet to develop.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Cheers.
So this is really just to flag for you, and we'll provide you with all the evidence. We don't need to go into it in detail today, but you can see, for example, in Levin Central, there's some big impacts for some families in terms of rates, as well as Queenwood. So they get up in the 9s in terms of rates as a portion of median household income. Foxton as well, in the Foxton South area, 9.29 in terms of rates as a portion of median household income in that area, I should say. And Foxton Beach isn't quite as high, but you can see they are in the 6s in some areas as well. Shannon as well, in the 6s in a big area in the 6. And then in the more surrounding areas, it's in the range of 1.4 to 2%. So in terms of the conversation, we've talked about it quite a bit, but what are some options for making rates more equitable? As we talked about just before, looking at reducing the level of fixed charges, some options around additional remissions, ensuring significant exacerbators pay their share. So that's around industries such as logging or forestry, or other areas that can be as well around making sure, for example, in the trade waste space, that they're paying their share of, that our trade waste levies make sure that they pay the share that they need to, in terms of contribution towards the maintenance and renewal of our wastewater pipes. So in terms of trade waste was one that came up in terms of the revenue financing policy review. So just to flag that's something that will come through that public-private split conversation a little bit later on. So when we've worked through the options, just as a starting position, we've picked a couple just to get you started, but ultimately now we can have more conversations about different options that you might like us to model as well. So what we've put together is just as a starting position is having a go at shifting all general rates from land value to capital value. So that's about $11.5 million worth of rates. Looking at shifting some of the fixed charges to capital value. So that one we picked was the library and community centre rate. We also looked at doing the library and community centre rate as well as the aquatic one, and then also looking at the library and community centre representation and governance as well. So there's lots of different options that we can do, but what we did was pick a couple, or pick 4, to at least give you some sense of what they were starting to look like. So as an option...
Jacinta, can I just ask you another question? Is there, in terms of those options, is there also scope to introduce, again, sort of catchments, and I'm thinking in particular for community centres, aquatics, those kind of things? Because one of the criticisms we hear will be from particularly the rural community and communities like Opigi, Tukumaru, Shannon, who'll say, well, we pay the same as somebody who lives in the middle of Levin for access to libraries, but yet, we don't. Yes, we've got the same right of access, but we don't we don't go to them because they're too far away. So in theory, is there a tool that would allow us to use catchments or sort of a geographical defined area that says, well, yeah, you might pay 100% of the rate, but in other areas it might be. So it's essentially a differential based on geographic area.
Ultimately, you can. It starts to make it more complicated from a rating structure perspective, but absolutely, from a geographical mapping perspective, if you were to draw boundaries around particular areas with a justification as to, from a principal perspective, why you were going to charge more or less as a proportion of the rate for individual areas because of access, then that is an option that you could have.
Okay.
You've got to make sure you're considering affordability in there and access to services as well, but absolutely that is something that you could consider.
I just wanted to ask a question. Is anyone exempt from paying rates? And are all sectors contributing? So I just asked the question as a fellow councillor, and we were unsure, but I just think to myself, do people like KiwiRail contribute when the rail that runs through here is on land that we have to maintain? Do NZTA contribute for State Highway 1, giving it that rateable land their road is on? Because we're charging our community for their local and rural roads. So I'm just raising it.
Unfortunately, those that draft the legislation on our behalf are very good at deciding who shouldn't pay, and often it's central government who decide that they shouldn't pay. So for the likes of development contributions, central government don't need to. And also for the likes of rates for roads and education, they don't need to pay rates. But that's a local government act decision rather than a council decision. So within the Local Government Rating Act, that prescribes who's non-rateable. And unfortunately, and that's something through processes where there are more roads coming through a district, you need to be careful, because effectively as more land becomes roads, particularly central government, then there's less rates coming in because the area which is road grows.
This might be a stupid one, but the utility companies, I recall there's even the Mangahau power station, they pay a little bit of rates, and obviously those utilities ones, from memory, was kind of really, like, I thought they make per annum and they're paying this much. At the same time, though, I think about our footpaths and land council owns where they might occupy. They've got their transformer or their chorus box or whatever on essentially what's out there. And there's obviously no, I'm assuming because I haven't heard about it, the fee for that per se. And if we were to say, okay, well, you've got this many boxes across this many parcels of our land, which works out to be this amount of space, and you don't pay for that effectively, and we know that the community needs your power, needs your phone lines, whatever, but as a goodwill gesture, because you're only paying this much rates, is there do you want to do a generous I don't know, is the question being asked, or in fact we do get fees from that or not? Like, what's with?
I'd have to come back to you on that one in terms of for facilities on our land. But in terms of answering one question, which was related around infrastructure or in particular utilities, Taupo, for example, they did a rates review a number of years back, and ended up in court because they went to capital value, and that was a significant change for providers in terms of the share that they needed to pay because they were going from land value to capital value. So all of that infrastructure, which previously would not have been part of the value for rating purposes, then became part of that value. So when you think about, for us, we don't have a massive commercial base, but those are some of the considerations in that space.
I was just going to provide the advice back to council that some councils put a differential in place for utilities, and actually this council attempted to do that a few years ago, and there was quite a lot of pushback from the time of the owners of the dam and our lights company. One of the important considerations council might want to think about with this rates review is that utilities also capture our provision of utilities, being drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities, and so we might want to think about the opportunities that might arise given we will no longer be paying rates for those utilities if Three Waters reform proceeds, and what might we do for a utility differential if reform was to proceed.
Jacinta, can I ask just one further question about in the commercial differential space? Would it be lawful to have a differential, or let's call it a rates weighting for earthquake prone buildings, like as an incentive to deal with earthquake prone buildings?
You mean in the form of some form of remission?
No, I'm thinking the opposite, where if you are an owner of an earthquake prone building, then there's obviously a higher level of risk associated with your building that council is partially managing, and so it's essentially it would be a financial incentive to deal with the earthquake prone nature of your building. And so once you dealt with that, then you would obviously move to a level where so it'll almost be like an additional weighting for those buildings that have received those notices.
I think that the legal test will be how is the owner of an earthquake prone building an exacerbator to council's cost to serve. And actually Mr. Harvey and I had a discussion just a couple of weeks ago, because at the moment we're going through the process of doing the final review of those buildings that aren't considered to be a priority route but are considered to possibly be earthquake prone, and there's quite a lot of administration but also costs sitting on council. That is currently a cost that is borne by the wider ratepayer. It sits as part of the general rate. It's not a cost we currently attribute to the building owner. So there's some mechanisms, and we're currently just waiting for some advice from Manawatu District Council, Sam, on how they dealt with that. So whether it's rates or whether it's a targeted fee, there are options.
Great. Well, that's good to hear, because that was exactly my point, is that it seems to be a lot of internal costs that are being borne by everyone across the district for these. I mean, that you can say that across a range of things, but in particular, this is one of these things that I think we should be prioritising. So that's good to hear. Thank you.
Okay, we're probably at the winding up stage in terms of information. But what I wanted to do is just you've got the presentation in your portal. We'll be adding more to it, and we'll continue to add to it and upload as more information we come through. In terms of Jeff at this stage has done the analysis at an individual level based on the SA2 or the bigger groups. But I'd like to make sure that for the individual, the smaller pockets, particularly where you can see the 10%, that you can actually see the individual impacts at that more granular level. So we'll upload those as you go. But what I'll do is I'll just talk you through what the analysis looks like, and then you'll be able to spend some time over the next couple of weeks working through the detail at a more granular level. You can ask questions in the next workshop. So as you can see, for each of the options, and as you work through the presentation, you'll see them here. But this is it in a total view, and this includes GST. So currently, 52.8 million is our total rates, excluding water meters, because we can't include that in this analysis because it makes it a little bit tricky. The rural is 13.1 of that, and the residential sector pays 39.7. So option 1, which was the proposal or the option for you to consider, which was moving all of the general rate to capital value. It's not necessarily something that we recommend, it was just one of the options to put forward, would mean that there would be a shift of $246,000 more being paid in the rural sector, and $246,000 less being paid in the residential sector. A key reason why that would be the case would be because there would be no longer that differential on land value that the rural sector currently receive. As well, for each option, you can see we've got 4,993 rural properties, 13,755 residential. So that gives you an idea of how many properties will be increasing or decreasing in terms of their rates based on option 1. And you go through and do the same for option 1, option 2, option 3, and option 4. Also, and this is one of those ones probably just want to spend a little bit of time quietly looking at rather than it on this screen, is for each of the different options as well. It gives you a view of how many properties are being impacted by how much. So for example, option 1, which was the shift from land value to capital value for general rate, there would be almost 2,000 properties which would have a decrease of between $100 and $150 in their total rate. So that just gives you an idea of what that is telling you. Also, for each of the different options, you'll also see for all of them what is the percentage change as well for how many properties in terms of that rate. So you can see both the dollar and the percentage there in terms of the different options as well. For residential and for rural. Then as you work through each SA2 area or the bigger one, you'll be able to see that same level of analysis, but just for those properties that are in the area that's being described. So for example, in the Foxton Beach SA2 area, there are 2 rural properties, 1,647 residential properties, and the different impacts that are being proposed as part of each of the individual options. So we'll work on pulling you together a full list. But to wrap up probably, are there any sort of burning options that you would really like us to make sure are included in some of the next pieces of analysis that you see?
Or maybe to frame it, if you don't know what those options might be, what are the problems or the things that you can see in our current rating system that you'd like to look for opportunities to resolve?
I'm happy to go first. You've probably already heard, Jacinta, I guess the 3 areas of focus for me were the forestry. I think in particular, I think we need to focus on that. The land banking, that is an area of concern for me, in particular in that industrial commercial land space. I guess I'm quite interested still to understand how the SUPs, if we're to retain targeted rates, how the SUPs might work, particularly in the care homes, retirement homes space, because that just seems to me to be a little bit excessive what we're doing in terms of charging. I fundamentally think it's wrong. For example, that a single resident in a 1-bedroom care room is paying essentially the same library or aquatic rate that I do as a household of 5 people. That just doesn't sit right. So I suppose that capital value picks up on that. But so if we were to retain targeted rates, I'd be keen to have that sort of some conversation around how the SUPs might work in that context.
And I think in just hearing that really good feedback and direction, Councillor Jennings, probably a note for us to do some work around some education around the difference between retirement homes and aged care homes and villages and how they are rated for, because it's different depending on the legal definition.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah, no, that would be good. It sounds like some educating of some councillors as well. Great, thank you.
In regards to your analysis, I know you guys have got your little table of properties that you've been using historically for rating. Could we have those with the scenarios? Is that too laborious? Because it'd be nice to have, a couple of actual scenarios to look at when we look at each option and what the change is for each.
Yeah, sure, that's absolutely fine. And another one that we're planning to bring is for all those properties that I think I mentioned earlier, but everyone that receives a rates rebate, what impact it is for them as well, so we can see a particular group that are in that lower income range. But definitely in terms of the examples, for sure. Yeah.
One of the other things that Jacinta and I have talked about is getting some, obviously not visibility over details, but kind of top 100, bottom 100 in terms of impact. To get a sense of the scale we're talking about. And when we're talking about the highest paying ratepayer, well, what are we talking about in terms of the type of land, what's on that land, and what does that mean versus the lowest, what little parcel is only paying X amount of dollars. Is there a way, those maps you showed earlier with the percentage of their income that they're in rates, with these options 1, 2, 3, 4, how that changes the colours on the shifts that occur applying each of those options? Is that possible to see the difference, or is it just it's a bit too much?
No, it's possible. Oh. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. In general, are some of those options that we've talked about, is that a good start for you? If we continue along with those, we add in some conversation around forestry and what's happening in that space. Land banking, Councillor Jennings, probably what we'll do is we'll look at some of those areas that have land banking occurring, and we'll bring back, like we will do for the examples, what that looks like under the different options and whether you can see that changing in a direction that maybe you'd like it to. The conversation about care homes versus retirement villages and the different impacts on rates there. Anything else at this stage? Just as you think about things and you look through the information, just feel free to fire Jeff or I through an email and just ask questions. If you want to have an individual session, if there's bits and pieces that you're not quite comfortable with, feel free to ask for that too. So thanks for your time.
Jacinta, sorry to be a pain. I think it was Pretty Hera that raised a question about the commercial space, like the commercial rates. Was there any work that you were going to do in that space, like around how we're setting what the overarching pool for commercial properties looks like?
Yeah, so we have a separate flag in the system, I understand, that tells us what the commercial properties are. So if we can bring back a sort of a snapshot of what that looks like for commercial, if that works.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And just to Monique's earlier point about the differential and that within utilities that would include our waters, like the government exempts themselves, could we exempt ourselves? And if we were to keep 3 waters?
I don't think we could exempt ourselves, but we could apply remission to ourselves, probably. But just remembering that rates are like a spider web. You pull here, and all you're going to do is cause pain there. I think the advice I was more suggesting was that if we weren't to retain ownership of the assets, is there an opportunity to think about this rates review maybe resetting where you think utilities should fall in terms of how much they're contributing by way of that could be a new entity that is then paying this council some rates. So a revenue source.
I'd be interested to know, when I asked that question earlier around are all sectors paying, I'd love to know how much the contribution is our ratepayers are to maintaining their services and their service levels by being exempt to paying or contributing to the district in the rating, what I spoke about earlier.
So you mean if central government were to pay an equivalent share, is that what you're saying? What would that look like?
Well, it's even a loss of what's the loss to the district by us maintaining those services for them.
Sorry, Jacinda, when that revaluation's done, will you apply the same options for these ones that you've got here so that we can compare in terms of what that revaluation looks like? Because there will be some areas that will have a greater revaluation than others, won't there?
Yes, there will. So what we're intending to do is to load effectively the new values in, just as with assuming no change, so that you can see what would happen with the rates given no policy changes, just with valuation changes, and then we would look to roll that through these different options. Yeah.
So these options are the average for, so like Foxton Beach and Foxton and Shannon, you've taken the average.
So for each area, there's a number of properties within there, so it's the median property, and because then that is the best way to get a sense of where it is rather than using the average that might have big swings on either side. Yeah.
Just one quick question, sorry. In terms of the revals, that's a QV thing. What is the cut-off date of those revaluations? So I know it's over. They were done 3 years ago, whatever. Is it March this year that the cut-off date was, or was it sort of a couple of weeks ago? Or, because what I'm saying is the valuations have gone sky high, of course, but in the meantime they've come plummeted as well. So I know it's out of our control, but just good to know. September.
Off the top of my head, it's August or September, I think. But we'll let you know. Yeah. So I think for Friday, once we get information, we get confirmation, then we'll look to. It would just be confidentially at this stage share with you that information, and we can give you a sense of what that is. Because you're absolutely right. There has been a lot of change in a short period of time. Yeah. Okay. Thanks everybody for the contribution and the engagement in the conversation. It's been really good. Cheers.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jacinda.